Welcome. I'm speaking from the United States, from Central Florida to be more precise, and we're in the midst of a political season. There's a story about a person who was supporting a particular candidate. Somebody comes up to him and says, "Tell me about your candidate. What does he stand for?" So he said, "He stands for what the people will fall for." And what I admire about him is that he approaches every problem with an open mouth. Of course, hopefully you wouldn't say that about your candidate, either of those things. But this is a political season in the United States. And what I want to talk about today, to some degree, involves what responsibilities you have if you're in a position of authority. Maybe it's a minor one. Maybe you just are a crew leader over a few other people. Or maybe, you have a greater responsibility. Maybe somebody who's listening to me, for all I know, maybe a very powerful person. I don't know everybody who's listening at this moment. But how do we handle our responsibilities? Today, I want to speak about the subject of the kingdom divides. The kingdom divides. Because it's a very critical time in the history of ancient Israel. The Bible has to say a lot about it. The kingdom divides. We had a situation in America. We just finished commemorating 150 years ago. In 2015 was the 150th year of the end of the American Civil War, which was the bloodiest in our history. We had a North versus South situation right here in the United States, much like what I'm going to be talking about today in the Bible. We did come back together again, though, as a country. The Union was saved, and in fact, I'm speaking today on the birthday of the president who saved the Union, Abraham Lincoln. If you are not American, I'm going to remind you that in America, if you ever come to America, on our currency, we have Lincoln on our penny and also on our $5 bill. The capital of the state of Nebraska is named after him. He's quite a beloved figure in this country. He kept the country together. Well, ancient Israel divided and remained divided over the centuries. And then much of the northern kingdom was eventually lost to history. And I'll be saying more about that in a moment. I'd like to go to the book of Galatians, the 6th chapter, and the 16th verse. This is the end of the book of Galatians. Paul writes to the church in Galatia, "And as many as walk according to this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God." He's repeating here what it says in the Psalms, the songs of ascent. Shalom al Yisrael. May there be peace upon Israel. But he says, may there be peace upon the Israel of God. If you are part of the church of God, if you have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, then spiritually speaking, you're part of a spiritual Israel. You're part of a spiritual nation that God is developing to set an example and to eventually make the world into a paradise. That's our ultimate, or that's at least a major goal of the spiritual Israel, will be ultimately to turn this world into a paradise. But the Israel of God has much to learn from ancient Israel, the church of Old Covenant days. I want to talk about some of those lessons today. I want to go back to 1 Kings, the 11th chapter. The wisest of men, Solomon, was ruling over Israel. And there was 40 years of peace and prosperity. And yet, Solomon, a wise king, began to think of himself as somehow an exception to the rule. There are people who know an awful lot or have a lot of wisdom and a lot of insight, and they can probably point out in other people a lot of their flaws in a very brilliant way. But can they reflect upon themselves? Can they see the problems in themselves? Or the saying that when you point a finger at somebody, there's 3 fingers pointing back at you. So Solomon knew what to do, but unfortunately he didn't follow through and didn't always do it. He knew what not to do, but unfortunately didn't often follow through and refrain from doing what was wrong. It's a very tragic story. 1 Kings 11 tells us, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites." What's the problem? These women did not share his spiritual values. These women came from idolatrous nations who performed all kinds of idolatrous practices, very wrong practices, evil practices. "From the nations of whom the Eternal had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you." Why? It wasn't a racial issue, it was a spiritual issue. "Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. So he had relationships with these various women, and they drew him away from God's way of life. He began making compromises. And I think in the beginning, he may have thought, well, it's just an innocent little thing. She has this custom. Let's just go along with it. And it got worse and worse and worse. Verse 3, and he had 700 wives. Well, obviously, the ideal in the Bible is one man, one woman for life. That's the ideal in the Bible. This is obviously far from that. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the eternal his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So various pagan gods are mentioned here that he got involved with. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Eternal, and did not fully follow the Eternal as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. Just terrible things. A lot of horrible things went on at these idolatrous ceremonies. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives. So you can just imagine all these wives, all these different little shrines being built. And this is the holy city. This is Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, and where the temple of God was. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. So the Eternal became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the eternal God of Israel, Yahweh, what we call in Hebrew today Adonai, Hashem, Lord, the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Eternal had commanded. He knew the right thing to do. Read the book of Proverbs. You know, it's there. Now later on, towards the end of his life, I think he finally got his act back together again. And you see in the book of Ecclesiastes, he understood the folly of what he had done. Was it too late for him to repent of it? And did he finally repent at the end of his life? It could be. The book of Ecclesiastes is very, again, full of great wisdom. But it's not enough to know it. One has to follow through. One has to do it. Therefore the Eternal said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I'm in 1 Kings 11:11, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Now he had promised David, Solomon would reign, but other kings afterwards, they weren't entitled to just rule over the whole country if they were sinful. Verse 12, nevertheless I will not do it in your days. For the sake of your father David, I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Verse 13, however, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. He had made a promise to David regarding his family. And that, of course, ultimately, the Davidic family gives us the Messiah, the Mashiach, the anointed one. The Messiah, humanly speaking, must be a descendant of David. The Christos, the Christ, must be a descendant of David. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son, for the sake of my first servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Now, Jerusalem was pretty much, generally speaking, within the territory of Judah. One little piece was in the territory of Benjamin. That's where the temple stood, Mount Moriah. But generally speaking, Jerusalem was within the territory of Judah. And the tribe of Judah was the tribe, of course, from which David came. The Davidic family was the family from the tribe of Judah. And that one tribe remained distinct. And the other tribes linked up with them and became known in history as the nation of Judah, or the Jews. Judah plus others from other tribes that mixed in with them became the southern kingdom, and the only Israelite kingdom that survived, because the northern kingdom, as I mentioned, as I alluded to, eventually disappeared from history. But let's go on to verse 14. Now, in fact, I want to go down from there. This talks about certain problems Solomon had towards the end of his reign. But I want to jump down to verse 26. Okay, this is because this is critical. This is critical to what I want to cover today. In 1 Kings 11 and verse 26. Then Solomon's servant Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, I'm speaking, American pronunciation here. Then Solomon's servant Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite. So let's just say something about the nation of Israel. In a way, there were two branches to the nation. There was the southern branch and the northern branch. At this point in time, they were cooperating together. The northern branch was dominated by the birthright family of Joseph, and there was Ephraim and Manasseh. They both became distinct tribes because Joseph was given a double portion. And then in the south was Judah. Now, there were two separate promises given to Abraham, and then ultimately through Isaac to Jacob, and then to the children of Israel, two distinct promises. One of great physical prosperity and power, and then the other a spiritual promise. The birthright and the scepter. We can use the English words race and grace. One was great political and physical and economic power, and the other had to do with spiritual power. And I want to go to 1 Chronicles 5 just to summarize that briefly. These are important points that I hope to deal with in later sermons. In 1 Chronicles 5, I want to go verse 2. Yet Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler. Yes, Jesus Christ, the ruler of the world, comes from Judah. Yet Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler, although the birthright was Joseph's. The birthright was Joseph's. So we had the birthright and the scepter, and the birthright being centered in the northern branch of the family, and the scepter being based in the southern branch of the family. Now, you're following all right now. Okay, good. I hope I haven't lost people here in this material. So now I want to go to verse 26. Then Solomon's servant, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite from Zereda, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, also rebelled against the king. So he had Gentiles who wanted to break away from being dominated by Israel, but now he had one of his own people who became a foe of his, a rival. How did this happen? Verse 27 explains, and following verses. And this is what caused him to rebel against the king. Solomon had built the Millo and repaired the damages to the city of David his father. The man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and Solomon, seeing that the young man was industrious, made him the officer over all the labor force of the house of Joseph. Now it happened at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite met him on the way, and he had clothed himself with a new garment, and the two were alone in the field. Very dramatic meeting. Here's Jeroboam, a young man, you might say on the upswing, showing a lot of ability, serving his king, and an administrator. And now we have this prophet confronting him, and he's got this new garment. And look what happens here. It's incredible. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. If he hadn't been a prophet of God, I suppose Jeroboam would have wanted to try to, strike him or something. So he'd take his new garment and tear it into 12 pieces. But this was a prophet of God. And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces. So this is a very dramatic way of showing him a prophecy that was going to come to pass. A very important prophecy in the Bible. Because this is the kingdom, the theocracy that God is using as his model. They were to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And now they're being split. Now he's going to administer his government through two different kingdoms. It's a major change in administration here and how God is dealing with his people. Verse 31, and he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Yahweh, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 tribes to you. So he gets 10 tribes, and David gets one, meaning, Judah. However, Benjamin, much of Benjamin also remains with the south. And so you have, in effect, 10 tribes in the north and 2 in the south. Now, Levi is scattered, although eventually most Levites come to the south. But remember, Joseph has a double portion. You have Ephraim and Manasseh. But he shall have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen, out of all the tribes of Israel. So evidently what happens is 10 tribes go north, 1 tribe goes south, and Benjamin is kind of split between the two. Because they have forsaken me, and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon, and have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes, and keep my statutes and my judgments, as did his father David. So there was a moral breakdown going on too, which is really sad. But that often happens when times are relatively peaceful and prosperous, people get lax. However, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, because I have made him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my dear servant David, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hands and give it to you, 10 tribes. So Solomon was going to rule all his life, but then 10 tribes will leave, and you'll be their ruler. So what should he have done? Well, he should have appreciated his responsibility and ruled righteously. Not follow Solomon in being idolatrous, but rather to worship the true God and obey the true God. Then he could have had a dynasty ruling year after year after year over the northern kingdom. But as we know, Jeroboam didn't do that. he also became a sinner, which is such very tragic. But I'm getting ahead of the story here. Let's go back. I'm in 1 Kings 11, verse 35. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and give it to you, 10 tribes. And to his son I will give 1 tribe, that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself to put my name there. So I will take you, and you shall reign over all your heart's desires, and you shall be king over Israel. So he'll have the bulk of that nation, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. He'll have the bulk of Israel that he will be ruling. Then it shall be, if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house as I built for David, and will give Israel to you. Now, at some point, centuries and centuries could theoretically go by, but at some point then the Messiah would need to come from the line of David. So possibly what could have happened is that the line of Jeroboam could have intermarried with the line of David, so that the Messiah would be a descendant of both in a sense. He had to be a descendant of David, so his father would have to be Davidic, but theoretically, he could have also had some ancestry from ancestry of Jeroboam too, so from some descent from Jeroboam. Well, anyway, that was not to be, because Jeroboam sinned. Anyway, verse 39. And I will afflict the descendants of David because of this, but not forever. Remember, he made a promise to David, and so the Messiah must come from David. But in the meantime, affliction, because David is not ruling, the family of David is not ruling over the whole nation. Verse 40. Solomon, therefore, I guess, got wind of this, so he was trying to thwart this. Solomon, therefore, sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did in his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the period that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Then Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. Now we have the crux of the situation here, because the northern kingdom had a relationship with the southern kingdom. They had come down and said, David, rule over all of us, which he did. Solomon ruled over all of them. But there were some problems. There were now tensions developing, because Solomon had developed the capital to a great degree, and he had forced labor. He had people that were conscripted to come and work and develop the capital city. So taxes were flowing into the capital. Work was being done to embellish the capital. There was a beautiful temple and a palace and so forth. But what about the rest of the country? In other words, there was a lot of wealth and power centered in the capital and not so much in the rest of the country. And the people were being heavily taxed. You see how these issues keep coming up in history. Chapter 12. And Rehoboam went to Shechem, to Shechem, a city in the territory of the Josephites, although it was, I believe, a Levitical city. For all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So it happened when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of Solomon and had been dwelling in Egypt, that they sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, so he became now a champion of the northern kingdom. They had issues with the family of David. They felt oppressed. They felt like they were being neglected, like all the wealth was pouring into the capital, and they were being neglected. Here's what we see in verse 4. Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father, and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. So they said, if you back off, if you're not so oppressive, we'll continue this relationship. So he said to them, depart for 3 days and come back to me. And the people departed. So now he had a chance to consider what they asked, what the request. And so what does a leader do? He goes to his advisors. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived. And he said, how do you advise me to answer these people? And they spoke to him, saying, if you will be a servant, this is what really a leader is from the biblical point of view. A leader has power. Why? So he can serve. A leader is a blessing to those under him because he's serving them through the authority that he has. His authority is making their life better. And they spoke to him, saying, if you will be a servant to these people today and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. There's loyalty from the bottom up, but there's also loyalty from the top down. Please remember that. when you consider government and how government should operate, particularly ecclesiastical government within the Church of God. There's loyalty from the bottom up, but there also needs to be loyalty from the top down. And they spoke to him, saying, if you will be a servant to these people and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. So now we have these people who maybe have less experience. These, you might say, these young know-it-alls, these wise guys. It's not that, it's not that being young is a problem, but in this case, these young people were problematic. Young doesn't equal problematic, but these young people were. Sometimes you could be old and very problematic, for that matter. We have a saying in America: "There's no fool like an old fool." So I'm not saying which is better. I'm just saying that his old advisors gave him good advice. His young advisors didn't, as we'll see. In verse 9, and he said to them, what advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, lighten the yoke which your father put on us? Now it seems to me that he went to them, maybe because partly he didn't like what the other people told him. And so these people told him what he wanted to hear, because I think he wanted to continue to reign over them with great power and to have great wealth and power centered in the capital. Anyway, verse 10, then the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy, but you made it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. You think my father was tough on you. I'm going to really be tough on you. Well, that's not a way to, there was a very wonderful book written years ago, How to Win Friends and Influence People. That was a required textbook for me in one of my classes, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Well, that's not a textbook that I guess Rehoboam was reading back then. Obviously, I'm being anachronistic. Verse 11, and now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastened you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king had directed, saying, come back to me the third day. So they told him what he should say. Now this is not so far what he's saying, this is what they're telling him to say. But unfortunately he listened to them. So as I said, how to win friends and influence people, at this point, I guess how to lose friends and alienate people is what he was doing. Verse 13, then the king answered the people roughly and rejected the advice which the elders had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So or literally scorpions. If you look in the margin, literally scorpions. So the king did not, by the way, I don't know if you have experience with scorpions. I used to keep the Festival of Tabernacles in Tucson, Arizona. And sometimes there you have scorpions that come around. But anyway, verse 15. So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the eternal. Remember, God had prophesied this through Ahijah. So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the eternal, that he might fulfill his word, which Yahweh had spoken by Ahijah, the Shilonite, to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, it reminds me of the American Revolution, right? No taxation without representation. Well, I guess they had representation. He just refused to listen. Now, when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, what share have we in David? So now they began to turn on. They were very loyal to David at first, and to Solomon too, but not anymore. What share have we with David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. So now we have a split. Secession, right? We have a split. And basically Israel leaves. So Israel departed to their tents. Most of the country rejected his leadership, his oppressive leadership. But Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the cities of Judah. So the southern kingdom remained loyal to him, as God again prophesied. And evidently a lot of Benjamin did as well. So he had Judah and Benjamin on his side. And Levites were with him. And later on more fled south and were with him. And there were also Simeonites there as well. Although some Simeonites separated, and Simeon became one of the lost 10 tribes. Although there were Simeonites within the family of Judah. I just wanted to mention that. Verse 18. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue, But all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Oh no. So he said, he sent a man to collect the taxes, the tribute, and you see what happened. They murdered him. Therefore, King Rehoboam uh, mounted his chariot and in haste to flee to Jerusalem. Get out of the northern kingdom. You might be assassinated like your tax collector was. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So at the time that this book was written, that split was there. And the split remained through history, unfortunately. Now it came to pass when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, they sent for him and called him to the congregation and made him king over all Israel. There was none who followed the house of David but the tribe of Judah only, in terms of whole tribes. And when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin. So, as I said, much of Benjamin, who was just north of Judah, stayed with Judah. 180,000 chosen men who were warriors to fight against the house of Israel, that he might restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. Now, evidently, if you want to look at history from the point of view of God's involvement in history, divine providence, it was God's will that the American Union be preserved. It was not God's will that this union at this point be preserved. He did will that there be a separate king in the north and in the south, and that's what happened. However, it was his will that both kings be righteous kings. The same religion would have applied. Think of South America. There are many countries in South America, but they're culturally related. That most of them speak the same language and have the same religion. So there could have been separate kingdoms speaking the same language and with the same religion, just separate kingdoms. But it didn't work out that way because the northern kingdom apostatized very quickly under that sinful King Jeroboam, a very great tragedy. But at this point, of course, that had not yet happened. Okay, so Rehoboam wanted to force the northern tribes to come back in. Verse 22. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, saying. So now we have another prophetic speaker, Shemaiah. Speak to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, saying, Thus says the Eternal, You shall not go up, nor fight against your brethren, the children of Israel. Let every man return to his house, for this thing is from me. Therefore they obeyed the word of the Eternal and turned back, according to the word of the Eternal. So in this case, they turned back, fortunately, because I guess they understood there's no point in doing this. Now later on, unfortunately, Rehoboam didn't consistently follow God, which was a very serious problem. Verse 25. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the mountains of Ephraim and dwelt there, and he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom may return to the house of David. He was afraid that when people made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to keep the festivals, they would decide, well, maybe we should go back and reunite, and then they would maybe assassinate him and reunite with Rehoboam. Now, he didn't need to think that way. God, through the prophet, told him, I'm giving you this northern kingdom. He lacked faith. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Eternal at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Therefore the king asked advice, and unfortunately, he had his PR people, his spin meisters. They told him, here's what you can do. You can develop a local religion here in the north, so they don't go to Jerusalem. So he made 2 calves of gold in the northern part of his kingdom and in the southern part. And, he had good arguments. Why schlep, to use a modern, to use a Yiddish term. They didn't speak Yiddish back then, I guess. But, why go all the way to Jerusalem? You keep the feast, closer to home. Besides that, you're always rushing at the last minute to get all that harvest in so you can go and keep the festival in the 7th month. Relax. Put it off a month. Keep the feast in the 8th month. It's more convenient. Keep it in the 8th month. So we had arguments. Therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. Now these calves were evidently symbolic of the throne of God. The people envisioned God as on the throne of this kind of an animal. And he set up one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan. So Bethel's in the southern part of the northern kingdom, Dan is in the northern part. Now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made shrines on the high places and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi. So now he defiled the priesthood, messed it up, so many Levites therefore probably fled south to Judah. Jeroboam ordained the feast on the 15th day of the 8th month. He postponed it 1 month, to keep them from going to Jerusalem. Take a little more time. Make sure you get your crop in, and then you can keep the feast a month later. And I'm the king. I say it's okay. My advisors say it's okay. These new priests I've appointed, they say it's okay. Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made. And at Bethel he installed the priests of the high places which he had made. So he made offerings on the altar which he had made at Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart. And he ordained a feast for the children of Israel and offered sacrifices on the altar and burned incense. Well, I won't go further into the account. The kingdom had split, and ideally there would have been the same religion, as I said, the same language, but two separate kingdoms, and God would have administered his government through these two separate kingdoms. However, both kings sinned. But unfortunately, Israel sinned so badly and eventually lost its connection to the covenant and disappeared from history. The southern kingdom, Judah, which had the temple, the priesthood, the Davidic monarchy, there were institutions there that kept the people from totally abandoning the covenant. So ultimately, Judah remained faithful to the covenant in the south, while the northern kingdom abandoned the covenant, became in effect Gentilized, and disappeared from history. The southern kingdom remained identified as Israel, and to this very day, the Jewish people, of course, are identified as the remnant of Israel. But there are important lessons we can learn from this division of the kingdom, which God allowed at that time, or even you could say God caused at that time, because of this, as a punishment, in effect, for the sins of Israel. It may very well be, ladies and gentlemen, that if God had not done this, in one sense, Israel could have been totally lost. By separating Israel and Judah, the southern kingdom, as I said, has certain reasons to stay faithful to the covenant, whereas the northern kingdom assimilated into the world, the southern kingdom did not. So maybe by separating them, he maintained, in that sense, a remnant loyal to the covenant to this very day. But in any case, there are lessons to learn from this division of the kingdom. I want to go to the book of Ephesians, and I'd like to go to the fifth chapter of Ephesians, Ephesians 5 and verse 15. Okay, Ephesians 5, verse 15, Paul writing to the church at Ephesus. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. So we need to have wisdom. We need to walk in wisdom, and we need to study the scriptures and absorb the lessons that are there so we can be wise, spiritually wise. He says, redeeming the time because the days are evil. There's so many factors that could pull us down, pull us the wrong way. We need to therefore be very careful and be wise, circumspect. Verse 17, therefore do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. We need to understand what the will of the Lord is. So when we read these historical accounts, we need to draw the spiritual lessons that we can draw from them. I want to mention two lessons today that we can draw. Number one, Solomon certainly was wise and certainly knew what was right and what was wrong, knew how to behave, knew so much about human nature, had so many insights. He could probably have looked at you and watched you and known what kind of person you were and could have given you all kinds of advice and correction. But the problem is, what about, number one, what good is it if you can see the flaws in others and not in yourself? What good is it if you know what is right and don't do it? What good is it if you know what is wrong but you do it? And so we have to understand it's not just enough to know what's right, but we have to do it. We have to commit ourselves to do it. It's not just enough to abstain, to know that what is wrong, but to make sure that we don't do it. So that's number one. One lesson is to follow through with what you know. Number two, the second lesson I want to emphasize today is when you're put in a position of responsibility, don't abuse your authority. Yes, you've been given responsibility, so use it. But use it, don't abuse it. Don't be oppressive. Don't treat your authority as a way of bullying and stomping on others and oppressing others in order to build up yourself. That's a wrong way to administer authority. Authority is given to you so as a benefit to others, so you can be a blessing to others, not oppress others. So certainly when you use authority, when you have authority, yes, use it, but don't abuse it. Don't be oppressive. Use authority as a servant of those over whom you are exercising that authority. Those are two very important lessons that we can think about as we study the history of when the kingdom divides.